You have been watching Prime Minister Justin Trudeau along with Chief Wally Burns, the chief of the James Smith Cree Nation, take reporters' questions on the Prime Minister's visit to the James Smith Cree Nation for the first time since the September 4th stabbing rampage, which devastated that community, leaving 10 dead and 18 injured at the hands of 32-year-old Miles Sanderson, who later died in police custody. Those entire incidents are still the subject of inquiries and provincial coroners' inquests, and as the hunt for answers and explanations on that remains ongoing. What you saw there today, the Prime Minister meeting with Chief Wally Burns, also Chief Robert Head, the chief of the Peter Chapman First Nation, and Chief Calvin Sanderson, chief of the Sakwatamo First Nation, and also family members and survivors of the attacks that happened on September the 4th, is the beginning of a process towards helping that community heal, to rebuild, to move towards progress on First Nations policing, on First Nations housing, and just better overall support on social services, mental health, addictions, and domestic violence for people in need. Listening in on all of this has been the CBC's Karina Roman, and I want to bring her in now. So Karina, there were some money announcements there today specific to these communities. Walk us through what Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had to announce.
Yeah, the money announcements were very much focused on the mental health aspect of all of this. $40 million over 6 years to build a new wellness center for the community. And in the short term, to repurpose their lodge to be sort of a wellness center in the short term. $2.5 million over 5 years to improve access to holistic treatment, to traditional and cultural appropriate treatment, to long-term care for those who suffer from substance abuse. And then, there was an additional money added to a program that already exists called Pathways to Safe Indigenous Communities. That originally, that program, I think, was funded by over $100 million over 5 years, I think back in the budget of 2021, but now they're adding $20 million to that to make sure that more First Nations can have access to this pathway, which is really about Indigenous designed programs. So that's the mental health piece, which they want focused on both the preventative so that they can help people before something horrible like this happens. There was some talk in the question and answer about what could have even been done for Miles Sanderson, while he was incarcerated in terms of mental health helps, but as soon as he got out as well. But also, there's still a lot of trauma in that community, and there are still people, some of the injured, who are still in hospital. So there's still a lot of work to be done, and there's people who don't want to move back into their houses because they're essentially crime scenes still. So, the mental health aspect was one of the #1 asks this community had.
Yeah, certainly two of the chiefs there, just to highlight what they said in the aftermath of the attacks. Chief Robert Head, the chief of the Peter Chapman First Nation, he called for funding to build a healing center to address long-term trauma. This is part of the announcement today. And also Chief Calvin Sanderson has talked about support for more mental health professionals and traditional knowledge keepers to help continue with some of the traditional healing. I was struck by one of the things he said today. He said that we get a new facility so we don't have to use our school for wakes and funerals anymore. The healers will have a place of their own. We'll all have a place to heal. So you can see the impact of building a facility like this for this community. But one of the other outstanding issues still, Karina, and we heard Chief Wally Burns taking questions on this, is progress on First Nations policing. A promise by the federal government to make that essential, but it's still very much a work in progress at this point, only 3 months after the tragedies in the nation.
It is. We do hear reassurances from the federal government that this is a priority, and that, of course, they want to work with First Nations and Indigenous leaders on this. They don't want to just impose a system. But they need this. The reason this, as the Prime Minister said, this is a very important legislative step, is to guarantee funding, you need to make it an essential service. Right now, it's very under-resourced. There is high reliance on the RCMP, which is what happened in this community. From what I understand, the RCMP, responded to the call of the first stabbing within minutes, but it took them over half an hour to get to the community. And so, to have your own local police force that is Indigenous-led and Indigenous-run, and there on the ground would make a big difference. But it's so under-resourced that even the communities that do have it in Canada don't have such high turnover and don't have the training and the capacity. So that's something that's being worked on. But we all know that the legislative process is not a super quick one. And so there are certainly pressing questions on, well, when would we see this actually be implemented? And there weren't any clear answers on that. But I was struck when the Prime Minister talked about the what ifs of this situation. You know, what if there had been proper mental health supports? What if, you know, you had a local police force that could have responded? I mean, you'll never know the answers to that, but it was quite striking that I'm sure that's a question that many people in the community continue to ask.
Yeah, and to be fair, we should point out some steps have been made. Marco Mendicino, the Public Safety Minister, did sign a letter of intent with the Prince Albert Grand Council last month. I believe it was in October, to work on this, to move towards an essential service. And the point being made by the Prime Minister that if you're going to do this meaningfully in a non-colonial way,
yes,
it's going to take a little bit longer than if you just impose it. And one other final point, Karina, just to make before we let you go, is there were questions about Miles Sanderson being released early without notification to the community. And this is something that was brought up in conversations with the survivors, with Chief Wally Burns. This, of course, is all under review by the parole board to see exactly how this sort of thing happened.
Yes, exactly. Well, he was, I believe it was statutory release, so it's when, you know, 2/3 of your sentence. And the idea is that then there is work, you know, so that they're not just released and there's no supervision, that they're released and then they can be sort of integrated back into the community. But if you don't even actually notify the community that someone has been released and there aren't the programs for that person, you know, then this sort of is a moot point on that. It doesn't really work the way it's supposed to work. But there's an inquiry on his death as well as the inquiry, of course, into the tragedy of the other 11, which included his brother, who was also killed. But I think there's still a lot of outstanding questions on that, and by the community, but also by critics of, you know, the federal parole system and how the supports that are actually in place for those who are incarcerated and then those who are released, whether you call it early or not, the purpose is to have them reintegrated.
Yep, still many questions to be answered by the coroner and by the parole board. All right, Karina, thanks for walking us through what you could today. It's the CBC's Karina Roman in Ottawa.